Thanks for coming out. So this is a really multi-layered conversation and program. There's a lot to sort of unpack and tackle. And I want to sort of start by saying, over the weekend, last weekend, I went to see this new film, Sorry to Bother You, which is this kind of Afro-centric, bizarre, kind of amazing film that really deals with race in a way that I've not seen before. But went to see it at BAM, which is our Brooklyn Academy of Music that we pride ourselves here in New York City. And so as the film was about to start, a note came up on the screen that said, this is part of the Racial Imaginary Institute that is dealing with whiteness and the ways in which whiteness has been misconstrued or misunderstood or challenged. And there was 3 young black folks in front of me. We were all reading it at the same time, and I saw their heads cock like, what? Wait, did I just read that right? Whiteness? Why are we talking about whiteness being misconstrued and challenged? And so it was such a marker of where we are with politics and race and the way in which we talk about it. But it's also, I think, a really important moment to kind of break it down and look at the different ways that Claudia Frankie, the poet who started the Racial Imaginary Institute, envisioned talking about whiteness. So
we're here to talk about whiteness.
Yeah, we're here to talk about whiteness. Yeah.
And as well, this essay that has kind of also brought us here this evening, which is the Phenomenology of Whiteness, quite a mouthful, but just to break it down a little bit, for those who have read the essay or haven't and are curious, phenomenology basically is that which appears and studying that which appears. So we're here today to talk about whiteness, how it appears, but also as well how it can erase other things and displace other things. And how we can perhaps recenter our narrative to talk about art and literature here through a different lens.
So we have 3 really interesting guests. We're going to start with an artist.
And that's Joey D. Minaya. So Joey D. Minaya is a Dominican-American artist whose work focuses on the construction of tropical identity as an exoticizing trope. She draws on histories of art, pattern, decor, and media in her work, often using her own body and personal experience as a primary reference point. So I'd love to welcome to the stage Joey D. Minaya.
The boots, though. Thanks. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess to perhaps get a little bit more information about your practice, this term exoticizing is, within the narrative of your work and what you do. I'd love to hear a little bit about perhaps, how performativity ties into the work that you create, and as well, perhaps, what representation means to you within the context of your work.
All right. Let's see, exoticizing. When I moved to New York, it just became very present to be singled out as different or other, even in such a cosmopolitan city as this. I grew up in the Dominican Republic, and I came here for undergrad, and I realized quickly that things like accent or this kind of fluidity in the way that people read me, or not fluidity, rather, they weren't sure what race I was, what mix I was. So that kind of thing came up very often. And then when I would say that I'm Dominican, I would get a lot of whatever people think Dominican is, which is something that I ended up addressing in my work. And that's kind of where my engagement with the ideas of the exotic come from.
Can I ask you, though, about exotification versus exoticization? Do you see a difference in those two terms? In my mind, because I certainly use those words in my work and writing, exotifying is less about fetishizing as it is othering, whereas exoticizing is very much about fetishizing. Do you see a distinction between those two?
I had never contemplated that distinction, but I can relate to both othering and fetishizing.
Right.
Although I didn't have separate words for it. I kind of exotification kind of had all of those ideas in it.
And that's also in terms of whiteness, right? Like
right, yeah. Like what is defined as neutral
exactly.
and the center, and what is periphery or other or different. Yeah.
I loved within your discussion of your work that you had written online that the work itself is about the performance of labor, decoration, beauty, leisure, and service. And in particular, this double-sided coin of labor and leisure is something that's quite challenging, but also I think maps back to the discourse that we're having here today, and this idea as well of kind of colonialism and the histories there. Can you speak a little bit about that labor and leisure?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, coming from the Caribbean, which is a place that has so much history, but so much of that history is kind of framed in terms of leisure, fantasies about, I don't know, the tropics, paradise. And then due to our history, we've been kind of in a position where that ends up becoming performative, because it's not paradise for people who live there, but because money comes from this idea of paradise, meaning through tourism, through the consumption of our island and identity in different forms, then I feel there's a lot of performativity, and that's the kind of performativity that I'm interested in kind of deconstructing in my work, in terms of how those ideas that are projected onto us are internalized and then performed back into the world. And I'm interested in kind of interjecting some intentionality in the way that is presented back into the world. And that's what I'm trying to find in my work.
It's so interesting that you say that it's a paradise to people who come, but not who live there.
Right.
Because paradise as a term has really been developed outside of where you are. Is there a form of paradise for you all who live there?
It's kind of paradoxical, because people do identify, nature around you as like this idea of paradise, yet the conditions of, everyday life are not necessarily that to the majority of the people. There's certainly like very, privileged people who live there that are very okay, and also, help maintain the conditions that keep them there. I don't know. Interestingly enough, a lot of people emigrate, and I guess searching for some sort of wellness that you could relate to paradise. Or there's also the, the heavy presence of like religious in our identity, which is also a way of thinking about paradise. But I think people are very aware of these ideas of paradise, and I guess that just changes for whoever is that you're asking. But I think people are aware of the performance of it and how our economy depends on it.
This performance of paradise, I guess, brings me to maybe chatting a little bit about why you situate yourself within your work. So with a lot of your work and kind of performance as well, you have your own body as center to the work. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Is it a choice? Is it something that has been deliberate throughout the course of your development as an artist?
Yeah. Yes, it's deliberate, and I guess it has to do with just the work coming out of my experience, a lot of it, or my observations. It also has to do with some sort of responsibility of representation, I think. I feel very ambiguous about using other people in my work and the responsibilities of that. I have used other people in my work, but usually...
Can you dig into that a little bit more? What makes you feel maybe a little bit ambiguous about it?
Well, the idea that the work circulates and its position in certain spaces where, I don't know, I like to have some sort of horizontality with the people that I work with. And I see a lot of verticality in other people's work that I'm not comfortable with in relation to, I guess, intersectional oppressions that are not addressed in a lot of work, I guess, in the art world.
So in that regard, you mean horizontality is more collaborative and verticality is more singular?
Yeah, maybe. I guess it's more of like the idea of choice and agency and willingness to participate in the work. Not necessarily collaboration as in collaborative concept-wise, but more, I usually remain the director, I guess, and whenever I use other people in my work. But I guess it has more to do with, I don't know, I guess I'm differencing it from a more, maybe things that you see in like social practice or appropriation of people's image, and then how that image circulates. And, you know, artwork might be sold. What does that mean that you're selling this person's face? Or I don't know. Those are things that I haven't entirely understood what they are for myself, so I'm a little careful around those. And yeah, I guess especially thinking about this idea of representing otherness in a way that is addressing the subject that others you. I don't want to necessarily. I'm just careful about representation in those aspects. Yeah.
So I think we'll ask Joy to stay and move a couple chairs down and bring out our next artist.
And our next artist is Genevieve Gagnard. Genevieve is a Los Angeles-based artist whose work focuses on photographic self-portraiture, sculpture, and installation to explore race, femininity, class, and their intersections. The daughter of a Black father and white mother, Genevieve interrogates notions of passing. She positions her own female body as the chief site of exploration, challenging viewers to navigate the powers and anxieties of intersectional identity. Welcome, Genevieve.
Genevieve. Hey, Genevieve.
Hello.
You gonna start?
Yeah, so to kick things off, I'm going to bring it back to the text. I'm going to do something daring. This complicated text that, brought us all here today, written by Sara Ahmed in 2007. She writes in her essay, "Whiteness itself is a straightening device. Bodies disappear into a sea of whiteness when they line up. This is not to make the fit between bodies and spaces natural. White bodies can line up only if they pass by approximating whiteness, by being like." Within your work, you do a lot of exploration of this idea of kind of dual identity and intersectionality, where things come into contact, but also maybe where things conflict. I'd love to hear you maybe talk a little bit about that tension.
Okay. So what I often will say is that we navigate through the world how others see us. And I typically use the word I pass. But in a recent conversation with a friend, I'm realizing I'm maybe using the wrong term.
What's your
Was that
term?
friend?
What's that?
Was that friend?
No, I had a conversation.
We were
Because
chatting
we talked
before.
about it in the green
Yeah, we were
room
chatting
too.
before. I
Yeah.
was trying to play it off.
Yeah.
Like, never met. No, another friend. But I had this conversation because we were going back and forth, and so this term that like passing means you're trying to, and I was thinking of it. Well, people give me the pass when they look at me. So I was unpacking that with her a little bit. And so I want to, work on my wording, because people kind of come to me in looking at the work and kind of having this full like understanding that I can kind of be like, this is how it is. And like, I'm speaking for every like mixed person, and it's a different story for everyone.
So the reason that I said that is because in the green room, we were talking about my son, who is racially ambiguous looking and mixed, but is Black. He Black identifies, but he also identifies as mixed, and he could present as white. And I know a lot of light-skinned, mixed Black folks who kind of think, shame on you for not seeing me as Black. But the truth is that we go through this world the way people see us, right? Mm-hmm. And so to say, I'm not what you think I am, I may present this way, but that is not what I am, I think is a really interesting thing to grapple with in art. And you do that in such a fascinating way.
I try and chip away at what that means. And my work, I think, is more asking more questions to help unpack the whole idea of it. But I was really thinking about that question as it's not only yes, I can line up, but it can kind of be broken down in my skin, but also the community that I grew up in. So I grew up in a predominantly white community. So there was this just falling into line because that's who I'm around. So I think the work I'm making is I can't be so definite about my opinion on things because now I'm old enough to kind of place myself in situations where I'm learning about the broader aspects of my identity. So it's constantly I'm learning something new or getting stumped and figuring out another way to approach it.
Totally. And I think, just to go back to the conversation we were having before in the green room, right? There was this language of presenting, right? And as opposed to passing.
Right.
And I do think that, just as there is this responsibility, as you were saying, of, kind of self-defining and as well challenging, those that you come into contact with to be open to that self-definition, there also is this other side of it, which I think can sometimes be quite tense. And as somebody who's of a mixed background myself, but identify as a Black woman, where the discussion of the language of mixed also can be something that can be quite difficult and controversial, right? And so I wonder within your work, I know that you kind of perform different selves within that, and selves that are coming from lots of different places that kind of have lots of different narratives. Within that, what has your experience been kind of wearing those faces?
Yeah. For the photography specifically, it's actually really nerve-wracking getting into a character because I feel I already go through the world feeling unsure of how I'm read, and then I put another layer that's maybe a stereotypical look or something that someone can kind of quickly make a read on, and I'm I don't know how that person even navigates through the world. So there's a lot of tension and confusion and questioning while I'm in that kind of mode of being the character.
You mentioned that you were raised in a predominantly white community, and I wonder if, as you're talking about the tension and the frustration and nerve-wracking of getting into these characters, if there's any kind of resentment of having been raised or grown up in a white environment that plays into that.
I don't know if I have that now. I'm it's a tool now, and this idea of owning both sides of a story. And so if I'm I'll say, I take on these white seeming characters to talk about Blackness, and I don't even really know if someone hears that, if they really know what that means. But I think when I was younger, I was always why did we have to live here?
Right, sure, sure.
So,
yeah.
And in terms of influences, I know that you've cited drag culture as being part of an influence. Can you speak a little bit about why that history is meaningful to you?
It mostly comes from stories of my mom living in Baltimore and hanging out with friends her friends were in some of the John Waters films.
Wow.
So I was kind of making up what, she's you can't watch the movies. So I was kind of making up what this.
Is your mom white?
My mom is white. And so, an interesting thing is that I feel like I got more understanding about my Blackness through my mom, because she made it a point to constantly talk about these things and show me things, not from like a super learned, understanding, I guess, of it, but she was at least like putting things in front of us that I kind of reference in my installations and stuff now. When I look back, like she had a Black history collection of books and different figurines, and I'm looking back now and I'm like, well, those were all like super racist and like not really the best thing to be like, oh yeah, that's your culture, but
Right, yeah.
But those were,
That's real. That's really real. Yeah.
Our parents try and
no,
fail.
thank you, Mom.
But I think it's a common experience. You're not alone in that. My mom, who is of a mixed background but identifies as a Black woman, is white presenting. Yes, yeah. And so it is quite interesting because throughout my growing up, very similarly, she spent a lot of time bringing home Black texts of different kinds and asserting that as being kind of part of our family narrative, which was very different than my dad, who was very much so Black presenting and appeared to be Black, right? So that was how he was read. And he took a very different approach to talking about that and actually was much more muted. So I do think sometimes, how these things grow within our family narratives and within our cultural narratives can be quite complicated and doesn't always go in a straight line.
Right.
As much as I'd like it to.
Yeah.
I mean, I do.
Be a lot easier.
I do feel, as I age and gain wisdom, and just that in some ways, it would be so much easier if it was cut and dry. It would be so much easier if it was, you are this, and you are this, and this is your community, and this is your community. And I think that in some ways, we're sort of tending back towards that in a way under this administration. Everybody's holding so dearly to the folks that they identify with and who they are seen as being part of. But I also think that holding those connections and those communities and those identities dear is what is going to allow us the strength to come back out and reconnect in an intersectional way. So, thank you. I'm going to have you scooch over, and we're going to bring out
Sarita McFadden. So Sarita McFadden is a writer and professor of English at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, City University, New York. Sarita's work largely deals with gender, politics, race, and culture, and explores the cultural narratives of communities. So please welcome Sarita.
one of my favorite writers, Sarita McFadden.
Oh, yay.
Sarita.
Hi.
Hi.
It's great to have you here.
So we started talking a little bit about Claudia Frankie and all her brilliance, but you've actually written about her and are very familiar with her text. Do you want to talk a little bit about your relationship with her, and also when she decided, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with this MacArthur Genius Grant. It's $100,000 a year for whatever, however many.
No, it's like $500,000, and I think it went up to like $625.
Okay, so she took all of that money and put it towards founding this Racial Imaginary Institute to study whiteness. Now, I mean, as folks, as Black women who love this woman, we're all like, is that really the best use of your money? But what ended up, in the years since, we've sort of had a more nuanced understanding of what that means.
Well, maybe it is the best use. I mean, when you look at Rankine's work, I'm guessing everybody in here has read Citizen. And, just someone who's like known and read a considerable amount of poetry, and particularly reading Rankine's poetry, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, an earlier collection, and then reading Citizen. just the kind of craft of how she creates space for you, the reader, to inhabit the poet-speaker voice, of understanding a host of really interior, intimate, tiny experiences is something that is powerful. But what was so successful about Citizen, before I was even asked to write about it, why I was like, how she uses the ranking you, the ubiquitous you, which allows you to like kind of live out these small, now we have a name for it, but I'm an older-ish person. We didn't have a name for it in the 90s, but we knew what we were like. But we knew these moments where you would feel, where there are these moments between the conflict, or not even the conflict, but more of like the moments where we, connect across racial identity, where moments of, miscommunication, or moments of like just watching how power shifts, for which actually kind of undermines and erases a Black body and identity in white encoded white spaces. We didn't have a language for it, but we all knew it and we all talked about it. Now in the 21st century, thank you, millennials, we have this term microaggressions to really kind of be the house to talk about those encounters. And what was so successful to have the poet voice, kind of like a poet, guide you through just a litany, a deluge of all of those moments, really kind of actually did a better job than what we've been trying to explain for a considerable amount of time about what that feels like, and why we actually need to have a much more detailed and nuanced conversation about our relationship with each other, about racisms, about systems of racisms that reinforce that.
So you just said racisms plural.
I feel like I want to say it plural.
Well,
I don't have a great explanation.
More about that?
I don't have a great explanation for that. I just feel like it's plural.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's also why we're here, right? Right.
Yeah.
Which is to create language.
Right.
And to have ways to converse.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what I loved about the book, and I ended up writing about it too, and like, the poet part of me was like, yes, finally, there's like this, I have language I can step outside of myself and inhabit, and be able to use that language to step outside of myself and inhabit, and then connect and use that as a tool to communicate and teach and connect with everyone else. So that was one part that was exciting for me about that work. But then two, why I say plural racisms, there's institutional and there's individual, and then there's the stereotypical manifestation of everyone thinking that racism is manifested in someone who wears a white hood and burns a cross. That performance
or uses the N-word.
Or uses the N-word, the performance of like, the kind of toxic racist identity. That lays so many people off the hook for the other tinier pieces of, racist slights.
Right. I mean, we're even, right, at this point now where we're talking a lot about this whole idea of racial bias or racial insensitivity or racial whatever, when in fact it's racist. We don't need to say it's racial. We don't need to qualify it as racial. It is racist. And that's really tricky and dangerous for a lot of folks in this framework of whiteness, right?
Right. So, I think one of the things, I've had so many conversations over the last 5 years. Let's go 5.
Yeah.
Let's just go 5. Let's just go with 5. But I've had so many conversations over the last 5 years that I find really interesting, where I've been trying to find the proper extended metaphor to articulate what I've been observing with white people, which is that they are doing something that we're like, at least let's say the liberal-ish, center left to left wing of white people in American society, in which I'm observing that they are starting to develop a double consciousness. Ooh. I mean, like, and I was like, oh, look at you guys.
Quickly hop in here.
Voices,
yes,
probably,
exactly.
Right?
Can we hop in here quickly?
Yeah.
Double consciousness. We're getting like that's a really important term point of reference. Can you explain a little bit?
You guys heard of this dude named W.E.B. Du Bois? Like from way back in the day. He wrote this thing called The Souls of Black Folk. All right, I'm gonna stop. But he wrote this book, The Souls of Black Folk, in which he tried to very poetically try to encapsulate what Black identity felt like in let's say the turn of the 20th century, where Blackness is always constantly aware of how society views Blackness. And Blackness also is always consciously aware of its Black self. Mm-hmm. And knowing those two things equal, like that's the paradox. You understand both in that simultaneity. And if you don't know how to wrestle or balance it, it could tear the soul asunder, right? Mm-hmm. All right? Mm-hmm. So I've been watching since we've said Black Lives Matter, and then like watching our lovely, beautiful, still need to learn some stuff, allies, really kind of come to like this point of really starting to understand the thing you guys have been saying to us all along. Oh, it really is a thing. It really is true. You're not crazy. I just saw it too. I just saw this white man walk while I'm walking down the street with you. I just saw this white man elbow his full body into your body in like where there was enough room on the sidewalk for you to walk. This idea is like he couldn't fathom the idea that the shared space, the shared public space, meant that he had to yield just a little bit of his space to yield so that I can have a little bit more space to continue down my path. Like that little like microaggressive nuance, although it was pretty aggressive, less microaggressive, because he really did like shoulder me. And then I was like, and he's like, I can't believe that happened. I was like, that's what white people do.
But also, I mean, what you said was like you're starting to see white people form a kind of double consciousness.
Right.
While, I mean, the irony is not knowing really who Du Bois is and what.
Right.
I mean, this is a very meta kind of concept.
No, it's super meta. And the thing is, like, I've been slowly watching, like, this, like, like it's a Trump doyle. Like some,
I'm sorry,
like,
what?
Like some, like the, I'm saying really bad French, guys, bad French. But it's, yeah, thank you. Trompe-l'oeil, right? Where there's a veil dropping, right? There's the illusion of I've always understood that this was the normal, but somehow I've understood that the normal was constructed. Now I'm starting to understand, wait, I actually have an identity. I'm not just normal.
Right.
Okay.
And so,
impact.
and like, and it has, and like, it exists in a whole bunch of there's context and intersections and power and class and gender, and it works within institutions. There's all this stuff that's happening there. So, so I use Westworld as an example sometimes in conversation to help folks figure it out. But like it is this meta conversation. In the last 5 years, I've like watched people of color and even like people of color, women of color, we already know what this is. We already know it. We already have a double consciousness and we're fluid with it. It happens like we move so quickly. But I'm watching white people on the center leftist spectrum really start to develop or realize that they have one too, and it's freaking them out. Mm-hmm. And then to the point that you were raising before, some folks, and maybe they're in a center and they might be center right. They're throwing tantrums about their realization of this this multiple consciousness, about the idea that a white is an identity for which now they have to but the idea that it's too much to share space with the idea of what a norm could be with people of color, if that makes sense.
It does. It certainly does. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was just going to kind of bring back what you were saying before about this kind of fractured communities of people kind of coexisting, running alongside of each other rather than intersecting, right? And like what work can be done to perhaps bring different groups together so that everyone is able to participate in some sort of collectivity as a discussion, as a politic, towards maybe some common humanity, right? And within that, I think with this discussion of microaggressions and this double consciousness, I think it's complicated, right? Because it does present, and I've seen with many dear white friends, allies, a crisis, right? People literally like, and these are things that for me, sometimes will have to check my reaction to that because these are things that I've lived through, right?
Right.
So there is this challenging moment to kind of figure out how to have those discussions, right? At these various points of our individual crises, right? And to find points of intersection within that. And how do you, I think that you do a lot of writing that looks out at the world, that examines the world. Within that, do you see opportunities to kind of find those places of connection?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I do. I mean, I'm thinking, what's great about the written word is that, on an intimate one-on-one level, if folks are seeking an answer to try and explore the nuances of identity and connection, then they can do that. That's part of the reason why, I really do lean, one of the things I lean on is Rankine's text. I'm like, here are these spaces in this moment, you can read this, and the thing that I'm telling you that feels abstract, that you can't touch, has somehow become tangible if you let the language lead you there. And my hope and goal is trying to find language, or at least understand that the language that we have available to us is inadequate to really try and deal with and engage with the complexities of our identity, and to the extent of how much we are comforted. And there's a thing in there in the whiteness,
Phenomenology of Whiteness.
I can't say phenomenology. I can't say phenomenology. It already sounds weird in my mouth. I was like, really? I was like, oh wow, okay. But this idea that, I think in terms of just storytelling. Storytelling is the way you find points of connection. Storytelling is where you find points of commonality. Storytelling allows you, is a kind of technology that helps to engender empathy so that people across identities become visible and seen. So it's a tool, it's a technology, it's an incisive practice. And one of the things that I think about constantly is, how can I ground a statistic in story? How can I ground the data in story? How folks look like, the data is helpful, but you can let your distance from the data, but but the human face, in terms of its connection to that story, to understand why the data exists and the data supports systems and institutions. That's the thing that I'm constantly kind of questioning and wrestling with. You can see it on a macro, and you can, and what we do individually in conversation is we default to really wild and holistic generalities, right? We use cliches, we use at the end of the day, it's just this, and all of that's trash, it's garbage. We need to be innovators about, we're in the 21st century, we have supercomputers in our pockets. I think by now, we should be able to figure out a way to innovate our language so that we can house all the complexities of who we are and be able to extend our memories beyond the 5 years, 10 years, to centuries, to understand patterns, and inequalities, and actually trust ourselves to be innovative about trying to imagine a future where we do the least harm to the planet and to ourselves.
I think a lot about the LGBTQ community, and the way in which they have been innovative about language just in the past 5 years. Because I'm going to use 5 years because that's what you do. But just the kind of confidence and the intellect and the heart and the empathy that it's just out there, and now it's part of the lexicon. Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not altogether sure why we are slow to do that in other communities, in other areas, but I do look to that community a lot as sort of taking agency and claiming sort of who they are and how they define who they are.
What the what the LGBTQ community does really well, of which I think, it's a conversation about space, right? It's about all of these conversations, whether how it exists in what form, whether it's through images or through word, we're really trying to I feel like we're really trying to extend the boundaries of space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps we're trying to, there's a rigidity that we might have had about space in terms of who and what can occupy what spaces. There's a rigidity, there's been a considerable amount of rigidity there. And I think what's really exciting, and besides, queer folk, Black teenagers, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thankfully with the, and the internets, you get to see just how people are transforming spaces and creating spaces, staking out space, making space for stuff that didn't have space before.
Right.
And how we as a culture yield to that energy.
Mm-hmm. So just quickly before, do you have something that you want to say? I just was going to bring it back to this sort of notion of whiteness, which I'm still struggling with, to hear from each of you, just sort of briefly, to your mind, in your work, in your life, what that means. Jo Reedy.
Whiteness. It's interesting because coming from a place where you are the norm, like mixed people, and then coming into a place where you're singled out as other gives you, I guess, some perspective. And I kind of go back and forth between those two experiences a lot. And I think because it's so, I don't want to say new, but maybe new in a way, like maybe the last 5 years, 7 years that I've been here. It's something that is still amorphous yet over present and very easy to tell, but I don't have a lot of language around it to explain it, but I can definitely tell, feel it. And that's a lot of what I react to in my work, in the sense of it's whiteness, but it's also global northness. It's also all the, economic, historic baggage that entails. And I guess the privileges of global north. Sara Ahmed in the text has a little passage where she's talking about being asked for her passport, coming into New York, and her showing her British passport and being asked, where are you from? And I totally relate to that. That has happened to me. And then when I was reading it, I wrote next to it, imagine having an accent and carrying that all around. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Genevieve?
The question is whiteness.
Just what does it mean to you? Just what does it mean to you? Briefly.
It's something that I fall into, and it's privilege, and it's something I want to get away from at times. But it's also who, in the work that I make, have to speak to, or what I need to speak to, in order to kind of make it like that's not the norm, make everything, put everything in the forefront so that there isn't a specific thing that is the norm. And I actually have this bag that says nobody's normal, that I was like, oh, this is, I don't know, that was my purpose. Yeah, I don't know if that's, yeah.
So, a couple of things come to mind. Blight. That's the first word. It's blight. But it's, I think of, you guys ever see that movie, The Never-Ending Story?
Like 12 times, yeah.
Okay, like, I saw it a bunch of times when I was a kid. I saw it recently as an adult because it was re-released in the theater, and I'm going to say it doesn't hold up well. But, I mean, like, the flying dog. Come on, guys. That was amazing, but, like, not really. But I think of the nothing. So, like, that's the image that comes to mind. I think of the nothing from The Never-Ending Story. But I also like, the other, but probably the more succinct thing, because everything is just abstract. But one thing that does come to mind is something Baldwin said, or I'm going to paraphrase James Baldwin really badly right now, for which, whiteness is not like whiteness is always in constant opposition to blackness. I mean, whiteness wouldn't know what it is if not for blackness, right? So it's more like I don't know who white people would think they are if they didn't have their foot on my neck. It's like basically like, what Baldwin said, but that's just kind of how I think of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I feel like it's something that I'm in constant pushback mode against. Do you want to open it up to the floor? Yeah, let's open it up to the floor for questions. We got one here. Do we have a mic going around? Yep, right here.
Hi. Thank you guys for the panel. It's really great. I wanted to speak to the language that you mentioned, Sarita. So what do you think is today's microaggression? Like, what do you think is something that we're experiencing that we don't know how to define yet, or we haven't defined yet? And I was just introduced to Claudia's work tonight. I'm not familiar with it, but I'm going to look into it. But I'm wondering, with that big project she did with the MacArthur grant, is that something they're working on, like some sort of dictionary, or I don't know, who's working on it, and is there something you think we're experiencing now that we need language for that it doesn't exist yet?
That's a great question because I don't know how to answer it. What I will say is that, I don't think I can point to a singular episode of anything that would actually constitute as the new microaggression. We're living in quite interesting times, for which I think all of that is its own kind of hot mess, gaslighting microaggression itself. And, I think, from what I can gather, I think part of the work of trying to address what whiteness is and think about, thinking about the construct of race is these conversations, for which folks from various degrees of having read a considerable amount of, me who's read a considerable amount of critical race theory, and, stuff forward, where all of us are trying to find different entry points into this conversation to at least try and come up with some sort of language, let alone really a narrative about who we are and how we go forward. And I think this is one step of that process.
I mean, I would add to that, again, as an elder who's been in this industry and sort of doing this work around race and writing about race and whatnot for quite a long time, is that if you feel uncomfortable, if something feels offensive, and when it does, that is racist. And it's okay for you to say that. So, for example, for a white man to ask me when it's okay for him to, or any white people to use the N-word, that's racist. He's using his privilege to put me in a position of having to defend a racial slur that has been used to dehumanize black folks forever. So I would say in terms of the new you've got to trust your gut as a person of color, as a black person.
I mean, also, we're living in a time where, quite literally, as you were saying, like, everywhere we are being gaslit. So I think it is incredibly important that that gut instinct remains intact, because the moment that we are kind of decentered from our own reality is where I think there's too much room, ample room made for kind of for disaster. I mean, for lack of a better word. Like, I mean, it's just, I think it is really crucial to kind of stay centered in that way.
I'd even add that, you know, maybe the new microaggression is trying to make people comfortable for calling them out.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, particularly, you know, the R word shuts people down considerably. To say, like, you know, this, like, you know, like, I'm not racist because I only understand racist to exist in this one kind of format. So therefore, and I'm not that toxic. So I, on the spectrum, I'm actually a great person, kind of thing. And the goal, like, and in those instances, if particularly when you're dealing with someone who's like blowing up like that, it puts you in a position of having to, like, you know, assuage and comfort in order to be truly heard, to address the harm and then correct the harm. You know, to Rebecca's point, you got to trust your gut. You'll, like, if it's not kosher, it's definitely not kosher,
right?
Like, and then say so. But you know, but don't necessarily feel obligated to make that person okay for actually correcting the harm.
But also,
addressing the harm.
people who don't experience racism don't get to decide what it is.
Exactly.
That's just that's a first rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Question in the back.
Hi, my name is LaRon Brooks. I work with Claudia and the Racial Imaginary Institute, among the curators, and I want to thank everyone here for this is a really wonderful discussion. And when we decided to do this project on whiteness, it was about not the study of whiteness, because there's like studies whiteness departments, there are plenty of books on that, right? It's about letting it, how can we find creative ways to let it be seen? Right? How do we find ways in which we as curators and artists can ask other artists to participate in a sort of dynamic conversation all over the city and in different forms about how do we deconstruct white supremacy?
Right.
Right?
Just because I have you, and I know you probably have a question, but I have a question for you. How do you differentiate in the Institute, but also in your work, the difference between white supremacy and whiteness?
Well, there is no difference in its iteration often, right? And so whiteness is an artificial concept. It's not real, right? There's Italian, there's Irish, but when you say I am white, you are taking upon yourself a power, a unity that forces blackness into the world, right? So to say that I am white necessarily goes hand in hand with the idea of white supremacy in its extension to institutions that run on automatic, in extension to, right? Because racism is about power, it's not bigotry. It's about the power of one identity and one community to force its reality on the other. So when Sara Ahmed in that article says, how do we deconstruct normal, right? It's about how do we deconstruct this idea of whiteness as the normal? How do we let it be seen in all of its iterations? And unfortunately, the way that, especially me as a black person, the way that I experience it is through the institutions that enforce it, that
and that
force
house
it into the
it,
world.
that quite literally house it. I mean, in the essay, there's a lot of discussion about like how that, you know, race can be perpetuated, housed, concealed, right? And the institution does a lot of work with that. So it's about kind of taking those walls down too.
Yeah, and how can artists, and how can, you know, people like yourself, I mean, you guys are brilliant. How can we all speak to this particular moment? Because we're kind of in trouble.
Kind of.
Right? Kind of, I know, before. I mean,
it's interesting though, the moment of trouble.
How I tiptoe into like disaster, right? But in terms of each of us, we are as creative people, as people with some kind of power in the world to actually begin these conversations with people who've never had these conversations. How do we make privilege? How do we make these kinds of powers that stretch into our lives and force policies onto us? And how can we make that visible? And then how can we deconstruct it in some particular way, get rid of it? Right.
I mean, I think largely, it starts at home. as I mentioned earlier, my son is mixed and my husband is white, and we live in a Black-centered family. Like, we actually consider ourselves a different kind of Black family because we are centered in Blackness. And I think that for your friendships and your allyships that are real friendships and allies, that you have to really flip the switch, or flip the script rather, where we have been living this normalcy where white is centered for so long, that we have to go all the way to the other side a bit. And for those folks who feel threatened by that or uncomfortable with that, those are folks who we're not ever going to convince. But I do think that, in terms of white supremacy and kind of looking at that and racist microaggressions and macroaggressions, we have to continue to kind of call it out in a way that we're not trying to make people feel comfortable. We're not, because the stakes are really too high right now. And so you just stand in who you are and moving to that other space, right?
Also, I think it's about realizing that we're here to talk about the racial imaginary, right? Like within that, and that the idea of imagination, what that can do as a computational strategy, is really important. And as a technology, right? Because we were talking about queerness and queer communities. Like, the work that's been done there has to kind of create a futurity and to give us language. I think has been really important. And equally within discussions of Blackness, right? The work that has been done within communities of Blackness, intersectional with feminism too, expanding feminism and making it possible for, more than a singular audience, right? So I think that imagination and kind of thinking about how we can continue to deploy that strategically to work against this kind of white imaginary is essential.
Yeah. I'd also turn back to Toni Morrison, man.
Yes.
Toni Morrison, for a long time, has been giving us gems and a blueprint to actually kind of challenge and combat and think critically about the imagination and center and decenter whiteness. So much so that if we really go back and look at all her old interviews and a lot of her talk, she is giving us, it's kind of a practice about how to do that decentering and actually center ourselves. Not even drop decenter, just center ourselves as a way to, kind of like repel the dominant normal, right? I think, the work of artists who are playing and imagining possibilities and also like challenging like really rigid images and structures is one way. Conversations like this is another way. Conversation is an art form in which dialogue is an art form. So from exchange to exchange, new bits of information gets thrown out there. I'm gonna also plug a book that I really think everybody should read. That's also helpful in terms of expanding and really rethinking a lot of stuff. And it's because I was like my default right now is thinking about the future. Thinking how and looking back, looking at Afrofuturism, right? Or like looking at all of these ways of which we try to where we're innovating and redefining and reshaping and imagining possible stories and possible futures and possible outcomes and solutions. But this book that I also would recommend reading too, that's also helpful, that I found helpful for these interesting times, is a book called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. If you haven't heard of it, it seems like it's a little bit self-help, but it's not. She's been a facilitator, activist work, doing activist work across a lot of different communities, queer communities, communities of color, but she uses the guiding principle of the book is informed by the work of Octavia Butler. If you haven't noticed, there's an Octavia Butler on my shirt. But thinking really specifically about Octavia Butler's body of work in terms of how she's tried to root story and center Black people in stories and imagine all of these different possibilities. But particularly the lessons from Parable of the Sower and Talents is kind of like one of the kernels of ideas that Brown uses to help look at the natural world in terms of thinking about how we can change and build and organize and develop communities. It's much more optimistic.
Also, just quickly add that centering Blackness or folks of color does not mean like shouting about how great we are. It's actually about deference on a very real level. It's about letting Black folks and folks of color actually set the tone. So often I feel like in feminism, intersectional feminism, white women allies to the left-leaning feel like they're being allies because they say, oh my God, she's so great. When in fact, but right? Am I wrong about that? Show me the lie. Yeah. When really it's about like being a bit deferential, like, okay, this person, will stand next to and support this person, but I don't need to decide how this person is heard.
Other questions?
Yeah, in the front row. Or
Got a few.
Hi, Loretta Green, Caribbean Me Magazine.
I'm sorry, again?
My name is Loretta Green. I'm with Caribbean Me Magazine. So my question is from a post-colonial theoretical construct, and especially when it comes to the intersectionality of aspects of exoticism and tropicalization, and how that positions itself within Blackness when it's othered because we're from another country as the Caribbean. Right. Mm-hmm. And even in Blackness, we're othered.
That's a long
That's
topic.
on you. Yeah.
Geez, I don't even know where to start. But yeah, I feel that very much. I don't know if you were addressing that to me. I'm just gonna take it. Yeah. Well, what I was saying, that anecdote about the passport, right? So I think being part of this empire, even if unwillingly, historically, is a privilege that is often not addressed. In Black communities where there's Black from all over, and then even just I want to be very thankful to the African American thought, history, writers, conceptual people, and at the same time I also want to carve space for my own history within that, because I feel like there's it's kind of contentious
Mm-hmm.
How we define Blackness moving from a place to another, and I feel like there should be more generosity and empathy in those conversations, because often the power takes over. And when I say the power, I'm talking about, again, the empire, English, schools of thought, global north.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But a good one. One more question. Got one in the front row. Yeah. Do you need a mic?
I don't.
Okay.
So I have a question and a comment. 2 comments. First comment, thank you so much. This has been very incredibly helpful for me. And a question for Genevieve. You mentioned using another word besides passing. What is that word?
Well, we talked about
Representation.
white.
White representing?
Yes.
Presenting, yeah.
And I'm just in conversation now realizing I need to incorporate that.
Okay.
So it's not something that,
It's in progress.
yes.
I would just add to that it's just about self-awareness, right? And how people see you and perceive you. And so you have to know that some folks are going to see you in a certain way, even though you feel very strongly about your identity.
And for Sarita, you mentioned about citizen and the beautiful, I've read it, and the beautiful element of the words and how it speaks to microaggressions. But I think what's great about citizen also are the visuals that are added to the book that also visualize microaggressions.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'd hard agree. I mean, what I love about the book is that it's like an art catalog book, like just like its production. Such as like a really smooth patina, and and the cleanness of the text, and the and the really the white spaces in the text, like between text and white spaces, but also by breaking up the movements of the book, using work of Nick Cave's work, Kara Walker's work, Glenn Ligon specifically, at a really pivotal moment where it's the screen, it's the work of Zora Neale Hurston's words, like that fade to black. I feel most black against a white background, repeated over and over again. The aesthetic of it is magnificent in terms of looking at how marrying her text to understand that it too is an artifact, a cultural art, an artifact, cultural artifact, and an art product against all of these other these really notable visual artists. Is there Wengechi Mutu in there too? Maybe not. I'm blanking on all the artists. There is one. Okay, but yeah, all the artists I stan are in this book, which is why I was like, oh man, I was really excited about this book, but to look at how the text is its own artwork in and of itself, and measure and put it and make it exist in a canon of Black artists that are doing the same interrogation of Black identity and representation, but more so also doing the critique of looking of Black identity and Black bodies as how whiteness perceives it. So that the tension between those two things there, exquisite. Thank you for reminding me about that. I can't believe I forgot.
And with that, we're going to end on that note. Thank you to my guests. Thank you all for coming out, and my co-host, Legacy. Thank you.